Welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right in today because we've got a seriously fascinating and honestly a pretty turbulent piece of American history to map out. We're looking at the framework laid out in Chapter 20 of Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States. This specific chapter zeroes in on the 1970s, framing it as a decade of profound American disillusionment.
So, let's kick things off with a really massive question raised right at the start of the text. After all those huge cultural and political upheavals of the 1960s, was the American establishment actually losing its grip on the public by the 1970s? Were things truly spinning out of control? It's a pretty compelling premise.
To unpack this, we're going to neutrally analyze the historical framework Zinn presents. Now, just to be clear, our goal here isn't to take a side or endorse a specific viewpoint. We are simply mapping out the source material. And Zinn's central argument is striking. He proposes that the 1970s brought on an unprecedented, severe crisis of authority for the ruling class. It's like a giant puzzle of power dynamics.
Let's look at Section 1, a system out of control. Zinn describes a system that felt completely unmoored, struggling to hold on to the traditional loyalty of its own citizens. Well, just look at this 1970s survey data from the University of Michigan. While 40% of professionals reported having low trust in the government, that number skyrocketed to 66% among unskilled blue-collar workers. That is literally two-thirds of that demographic saying they've lost faith. The disillusionment was deep, and you can see it was heavily concentrated among the working class.
And this wasn't just some abstract vibe, right? It translated directly to the ballot box. Zinn notes that the number of voters who completely refused to identify as either Democrats or Republicans absolutely surged. Back in 1940, only 20% called themselves independents. By 1974, that number leaped to 34%. The traditional two-party system was fracturing in real time.
But here's where it gets wild. This anti-establishment mood started bleeding into the actual bedrock of American law and order. Even the courts, juries, and judges stopped behaving the way the establishment expected. Zinn lists some crazy examples. Angela Davis, a well-known radical, was acquitted by an all-white jury. Black Panthers were freed by juries in multiple trials despite massive government pressure. In Massachusetts, a judge just straight up dismissed the case against an activist named Sam Lovejoy who had actually toppled a 500-foot utility tower to protest the nuclear plant. And in D.C., a judge outright refused to sentence people who stepped out of a White House tour line to protest the Cambodia bombing. The legal system itself was kind of rebelling.
Which naturally brings us to Section 2, the establishment reacts.
Because, as you can imagine, political elites started viewing this public awakening as a direct threat. The chapter highlights the intense anxiety of political scientists at the time, specifically guys like Samuel Huntington. He wrote that the very essence of this 1960s surge was a general challenge to all systems of authority. He was deeply worried that people just no longer felt obligated to obey the folks they used to consider their superiors in rank, age, or status.
According to Huntington's analysis, cited by Zinn, this challenge wasn't just happening at protests. Actually, it was happening in the family, inside universities, and in corporate offices, and it created immense, tangible problems for what he called the governability of democracy. Basically, if the public simply won't follow, how on earth are the leaders supposed to lead?
To really grasp this elite panic, we have to look at Huntington's definition of the establishment. He argued that post-World War II America wasn't just run by elected officials. It was governed by the president acting together with a very specific elite group. We're talking key individuals in the executive office, the bureaucracy, Congress, major businesses, banks, and the media. And the authority of this exact group? It was rapidly tanking in the eyes of everyday Americans.
All right, moving to Section 3, purging the rascals.
Faced with this massive crisis of legitimacy, Zinn argues the system realized it had to execute a massive public course correction. He interprets the huge, dramatic events of 1974 and 1975 through a very specific lens. So the resignation of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford taking over, and those shocking congressional exposures of bad deeds by the FBI and CIA, Zinn doesn't view these as the system breaking down. He views them as the system deliberately purging itself of the rascals. The goal was basically to cauterize the wound and win back the public's confidence.
But did it actually work? Let's hit Section 4, the unresolved resistance.
Zinn illustrates that the resistance was very much unresolved by contrasting the events of 1976. Now, this was the American bicentennial, supposed to be this grand, unifying 200th birthday party for the nation. But running right alongside the official government events, there were massive counter-protests, driven by deep public suspicion.
The text refers to this as the People's Bicentennial.
And honestly, this perfectly captures the mood of the whole era. Up in Boston, citizens staged a modern, 1970s version of the Boston Tea Party. But instead of British tea, huge crowds dumped packages marked with the names of giant oil companies, like Gulf Oil and Exxon, straight into the harbor. Talk about a bold visual. It was a massive symbol of their ongoing opposition to corporate power and an establishment they felt just didn't represent them anymore.
So, this historical analysis leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought. It really forces us to step back and look at the delicate, sometimes invisible balance of power in our society. When the powerful institutions push one way and the public pushes another, in a democracy, who is truly in control? It's a question the 1970s completely cracked open, and honestly, one that we are definitely still wrestling with today. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll catch you next time.